One of the types of graphics you will be working with in Final Cut Pro are Photoshop documents. One thing to know about Photoshop documents is that when they're created, the artist often will create each separate element on a separate layer. And when you bring this document into Final Cut Pro maintains each of those layers. Let's take a look at Running the Sahara title.psd. I'm going to go ahead and drag this clip into our viewer as we talk about it. Now this is the title, Running the Sahara, that our artist created. If we look at the image, and we saw this in an earlier lesson, the Photoshop document doesn't look like the other documents, the TIFF and the PNG file. It actually looks more like our Running the Sahara sequence icon. That's because a Photoshop document will come in with all its layers intact, and it actually works like a sequence if you double click on it. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this to load this into the timeline, and we can look at it in a little more detail. So when you double click a Photoshop document, it doesn't load it directly in the viewer, it actually opens up a timeline. And if I look at this timeline, I actually see three separate elements. Running the Sahara. What's really cool about this is that if the artist didn't quite position things where I want, I can adjust them without having to open up Photoshop. To do this, I would go into Wireframe, click on the drop-down menu, and switch to Image plus Wireframe. Once in Wireframe, I can go ahead and reposition Running with the Sahara any way I want. Well, not quite any way I want, because there's one more thing you need to know when creating titles, and that's something called Title Safe. If we click in the same area that we just used to create Image plus Wireframe, there's an option to show Title Safe. And this will bring up a grid of two separate boxes. The outer box is considered Action Safe. On most televisions, anything outside of Action Safe is not seen because the image is blown up beyond the edges of the screen. The inner box is called Title Safe. Now, items may be seen outside of Title Safe, but there's a risk that the image distorts as it approaches the edge of the screen. So whenever you're working with titles for a client or putting a logo in, you always want to respect the inner Title Safe box when putting in any text. Now, you also may notice there's a couple of little tick marks here. This is a new feature of Final Cut Pro 7. These tick marks represent what would happen if the image was shown on a 3x4 television or a standard definition television. The outer one, of course, is our Action Safe, and then we have our Title Safe. So if you know you're doing a program that's going to air both on a widescreen television and also on a standard definition television where they're going to cut off the sides completely, you'll want to take care to use these inner tick marks. So let's go ahead and position our elements inside the Title Safe, but make them a little more our own versus how the graphic artist designed them. Now what you'll notice is as I move these around here, if I jump back to my main image, to grab it back over here into my viewer, it's been updated. Now how can we work with bringing this into our timeline? We bring this into our timeline just like any other clip. If I want to put it over sun panning, I simply place my cursor over the clip, and without marking an in or an out point, I can simply grab it, drag it, and drop it onto Superimpose. Whenever you drag a clip onto Superimpose and there are no in and out points in your timeline, Final Cut will always make the clip that's inserted the exact same duration of the clip below it. Now we're going to match the cross dissolve of the end of the clip. I'm going to hold down the Option key and grab cross dissolve and drag it up and drop it on the clip above. By holding the Option key, instead of moving the dissolve, I'm actually copying the dissolve. Let's play it and see how it looks.
It's the most unforgiving place on earth.
Well, it fades out really nicely, but how does it come on? I'm going to drag over to the beginning of my timeline and hit play. I think we should have Running with the Sahara fade on as our sky panning fades on. But another thing we can do with a Photoshop document is I can control each layer individually, and they don't all have to fade on at once. They can fade on a little more slowly, or you can use different effects to bring them on. To do this, I simply double-click on the Photoshop document in the timeline, and it opens up another tab which contains all three individual elements. Before we start animating how the text comes in, I'm going to tweak the a little bit over so that it doesn't overlap the word Sahara. If I wanted to time this so that Running comes in first, the second, and Sahara third, all I have to do is go down to my timeline. I see very clearly that Running is the first clip. I'm going to drag the over a little bit, and then I'm going to drag Sahara over a little bit more. And now I'm going to simply right-click and put dissolves in and bring them on one at a time. I see we're not quite timed as well as I'd like here, so I can go ahead and just move this up a little bit and stretch out the tail. If we go back to our main timeline, move our playhead to the beginning of the show, we can now hit play and see how Running the Sahara appears in our show. Final Cut Studio is an outstanding suite of applications, but don't forget it easily integrates with many other applications on the market.